I took the privilege of not using a PowerPoint presentation because I've just finished 8 months of lecturing to students with very long PowerPoints, and I'm totally sick of it. So if it's okay, I'm just going to speak from some notes, but don't hesitate in the Q&A if there's any further details or so on that you'd like me to share from any of the references that I make. So it's such a pleasure to be here. Thanks, Alina, very much. It's a nice coincidence to be sitting next to you again, not in a graduate seminar, as we were 10 years ago. And thanks also to the other panel members for this opportunity, because I've been following their work closely as part of the Asia Foundation LSE collaboration. They've been doing some really interesting research on issues of post-conflict state building. It's really lovely, especially to have the opportunity to talk about some of the bigger theoretical or broader political science issues around elections in post-conflict states. In my home department at York, I'm one of very few empirical political scientists. I never get to talk about theory, so this is also a really nice opportunity. So as Alina noted at least in the post online, there are at least 3 big challenges or simultaneous demands put on post-conflict states by donors and by the international community. And those are to build a functioning and legitimate state, to develop an open and inclusive, hopefully representative political order, and to revitalize the links between state and society. Now, it's assumed in many policy statements and program documents aimed at promoting democracy internationally that elections are going to be a crucial part of that process, and that they will help enable the reconstruction of political systems in post-war states. It's also assumed that elections will somehow help achieve these 3 goals because they provide legitimacy for the state, the political order that underpins that state, and in theory, they help reconnect state and society. Of course, ultimately, democratic elections are a part of these 3 goals, but they may not be a sufficient condition on their own to do so. Worse, sometimes they can undermine these goals when other crucial organizations or institutions are not already in place. And that's what the political scientists from all spectrums of the field agree on. So I'll just get into what some of those issues are around the prerequisites that need to be in place for elections to be peaceful, but what happens when those prerequisites either can't be or aren't in place. So the focus of what I want to talk about is these junctures or disjunctures between democratization, particularly the electoral process involved in that, and violence in post-conflict states. As we all know, elections provide a vital symbolic measure of democracy, and without that, systems can falter. They also help to provide the roots of legitimacy for the state, the order, and the society that lives in that place. And the recent elections in Afghanistan are representative of the issue of legitimacy and how important it is. And if we look back to the ballot in '99 in East Timor, we see how important referendums and other forms of elections can be in determining the legitimacy and of future states. So in essence, elections are a crucial part of a picture, but must be recognized and implemented as part of a complex political whole, not a standalone end in themselves, nor in any sense, the only way or means to deliver stable and legitimate government. So political scientists agree, it's interesting that they agree on this, but I've dug into some of the different sources on it, and they really do agree on the fact that a whole set of political organizations and institutions have to be in place for them to deliver this legitimacy if this state-building process is to be stable and political reconstruction is to be peaceful. Now that's where obviously this stuff gets difficult, because how can you delay elections in certain contexts to allow the time for political institutions and organizations to develop? That's one of the big issues. So this is where the contest emerges between different democratic theorists, which is over the sequencing of different prerequisites, which is the most important, which should come in first, which do you have to have before you have an election. And that's where there is quite a lot of contest. Some, and I'll highlight who, say that the sequencing is a kind of barking up the wrong tree, and all these things have to happen at once but gradually, and that you can't expect things to happen in a slow and ordered manner. But above all, we have to understand the fundamental links between democratization and processes of violence, because the two are very much intertwined. And it's these prerequisites that are the things that can either prevent the violence taking place or could at least make it less likely that it will happen. Because if a democratization process is violent, this is one surefire way of delegitimizing either a process, a political party system, and a set of organizations, of voting procedures, even the whole enterprise of democracy itself. Yet sometimes, and this is what some theorists find, you still need to go ahead, even if violence will take place, it still needs to happen. And that's something that's difficult for policymakers sometimes to engage with. The danger is, of course, that without the appropriate institutional organizational setting, democratic competition is incredibly fraught. Releasing competitive elections onto a state that does not have strong organizations and institutions in place is a very risky business. So let's turn to what perhaps the classic study on violence and democratization, which is by Mansfield and Snyder. And their series of papers and books argue that emergent democracies will tend to go towards war. And this is based on historical experience. That's where the empirical evidence points. And they provide a list of the required strong political institutions that need to be in place in order for this violence not to happen. So these are an effective state. This is what's got to be in place before you have elections. A strong rule of law, an organised party system and strong party organisations, and a professional news media. Now, all of those things may be missing from a post-conflict state, so it's hard to see how and what do you do first in that scenario. But a particular danger that they warn of is that when all of these things are weak, politicians tend to resort to nationalism as a means to combat their opponents in elections. Now, nationalism in competitive elections in a weak state system with a weak rule of law, with a weak news media and a weak party system will almost inevitably lead to a violent outcome. When you have one or more of those institutions or organizations in place, then you'll have less likelihood of a violent outcome. So we can already see there's this tension between getting the house in order before you have elections or having elections because you need the legitimacy to build those institutions. So there's a difficult trade-off there. Some other political scientists, Dahl, Nordlinger and Huntington, they all argue for the development of political institutions before popular political participation as well, if democracy is to function properly and peacefully. Going even further, Rustow argues that you have to have wealth, literacy, a large middle class, as well as the rule of law and a free press for democracy to function. These are big asks in developed countries, let alone in fragile post-conflict states. That list is very demanding, but if you look at the cases that they've compared and modelled globally, without any of those particular things in place, the tendency will be for elections to lead almost inevitably towards some sort of violent outcome. Now, we can find some outliers where you may have high literacy but low wealth. Somewhere like Sri Lanka might be an example of that. They may have a larger middle class or a larger educated class and can cope with different sorts of civil society development and organisation, but you don't require a large amount of wealth. But still, those kind of cases are outliers rather than the general rule. So someone who many of you would be familiar with, Thomas Carruthers, who's written a lot on democracy assistance programs. He's with the I think it's the Carnegie Foundation. He talks about the irrelevance of these prerequisites in so many post-conflict states because of the difficulties of trying to get all those things in place. The pressures on 21st century democratization programs are such that we can't wait, like 19th century Britain, which built up a strong rule of law, a whole number of very deeply embedded and strong political organizations and institutions before popular emancipation took place. So you can ask whether it's even possible to compare the way that democratization emerged in the 19th century or in other post-conflict, post-revolutionary states in Europe with contemporary 21st century democratization processes today. I just wanted to read out a quote from some of these authors, that the hardest struggles in a democracy are those against the birth defects of a political community. Without a strong sense of political community and an agreed upon national political identity, competitive elections are a very risky business. So there's some other evidence that I won't go into around the links between ethnic pluralism and violence, but we can always discuss that in the Q&A. So just to refresh what some of the prerequisites that the political scientists agree on needing to be in place. Aside from those we've already discussed, a strong civil society is also found to be a very relevant factor to prevent violence from emerging. I've already highlighted literacy and middle class, a strong middle class. Strong political institutions. Now they may be bureaucratic institutions or party organizations. And then this other set of authors that focus on economic and social development as being a prerequisite for democracy rather than the other way around. Adrian Lefwich, a wonderful colleague at York who unfortunately died recently, has written a wonderful series of things on democracy and development and the links between the two, and arguing that it may be development that comes first rather than democracy that will bring about development. And many Southeast Asian states have shown that tendency. The other danger we need to watch for with elections is that they can provide political legitimacy, but legitimacy to whom? Are they providing it to authoritarian or semi-authoritarian regimes that will run elections to get legitimacy, but the elections don't actually mean any form of proper representation or inclusion from a wider set of society than the particular elite in charge? So some final thoughts. First, lots of the political theorists argue for having the time and space to develop political institutions necessary, the political organizations necessary to allow elections to run peacefully. But do we have such space and time in this 21st century policy world? And I'm sure my colleagues will reflect on that in more depth. Second, do representative political orders come before or after elections? Because elections can exclude people as much as they can include them. And we can think about what's happened recently in Egypt and other examples where without proper representative constitutions being established first, you will necessarily have minorities being excluded, or in some cases minorities excluding majorities. In very new states, voting processes are so complex that they may not understand why it's necessary, the general population may not understand why it's necessary to have a constitutional process first before elections, but the lessons from places like Egypt show us why that's so important. So the big question, just to finish, is how do you secure legitimacy? How do you delay elections while you develop institutions and the political order necessary to underpin peaceful elections? Is that even possible? But if you do it the other way round, and you run the elections before the institutions and before the population is really ready to cope with what a competitive electoral system looks like, you may then end up with some really popular demagogues in power rather than genuinely democratic literate leaders. Now, the balance is obviously a very difficult one to achieve, and I'm very glad that it's my colleagues and not me that's having to come up with the answers there. But it shows us that even though the political scientists may have the theory and the data to tell us what order things have to be in, the empirical realities are, of course, much more complex. And perhaps it's Carruthers' concept of gradualism, whereby elections are enabled at the same time as the development of all these different political institutions and state organizations that are also required, that gives us the space to think about how these things have to be done at the same time, because we don't have the luxury of the time and space that Western advanced democracies have had to achieve these things.